It was a bright, sunny afternoon in a small town where everyone knew each other's names. The streets were buzzing with life, children laughing, mothers chatting, and the sounds of cars rumbling by. In the middle of all this activity was Mrs. Thompson's corner shop. It was a cozy place filled with snacks, drinks, and all sorts of goodies that made it a favorite among the locals. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Mrs. Thompson, a kind woman in her 60s with curly gray hair, loved her shop. She had been running it for over 20 years and had seen countless faces come and go. She always greeted her customers with a warm smile and a friendly wave. On this particular day, she was behind the counter, restocking some shelves, humming a cheerful tune. But little did she know, something unusual was about to happen that would change her day completely. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, and in walked a scruffy-looking dog. His fur was a mix of browns and blacks, and his big, sad eyes seemed to hold a world of stories. Mrs. Thompson had seen this dog before. He was a stray that wandered the neighborhood. She called him Buddy because he always seemed to be looking for friends. But today was different. Today, he was an empty pod. As Buddy entered the shop, he dragged something behind him. Mrs. Thompson squinted to see what it was. "What do you have there, Buddy?" she asked, curiosity bubbling inside her. The dog stopped right in front of her and dropped the object at her feet with a soft thud. It was a doll. But not just any doll. This doll was old and worn out, its dress frayed and dirty. It looked like it had been loved a lot, but now it had seen better days. The doll's hair was a tangled mess, and one of its button eyes was missing. Mrs. Thompson knelt down to get a closer look, her heart warming at the sight. "Where did you find this, Buddy?" she wondered aloud, gently picking up the doll. It was as if the dog had brought her a special gift. But why? She looked into Buddy's eyes and saw a flicker of hope there. Maybe this doll meant something important to him. Every day for the past week, Buddy had come to the shop. He would sit outside, watching the people go by, his eyes shining with a mix of curiosity and longing. And now, here he was, bringing in this doll like it was the most precious treasure in the world. Mrs. Thompson felt a little tug at her heart. "You really care about this doll, don't you?" she said softly. Just then, the bell jingled again, and in walked Mr. Jenkins, a tall man with a deep voice and a frown that seemed to be stuck on his face. He was a regular customer, but not the friendliest. Mrs. Thompson knew he was a hard man, and he sometimes made rude comments, especially about people who didn't look like him. "What's going on here?" Mr. Jenkins asked, narrowing his eyes at Buddy. "Why is that mud in your shop?" His tone was harsh, and Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't like how he looked at the dog, as if he was nothing more than a nuisance. Now, Mr. Jenkins, he's just a dog." "He means no harm," Mrs. Thompson replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She felt the tension in the air, as if the room had suddenly grown colder. Mr. Jenkins scoffed, crossing his arms. "That's what they all say. Strays are just trouble. You never know where they've been or what they might do." His words hung heavy in the air, and Mrs. Thompson felt a rush of anger rise within her. Why was it always so easy for some people to judge others based on appearances? Buddy, sensing the tension, tucked his tail between his legs and backed away slightly. Mrs. Thompson could see that the dog was scared, and it broke her heart. "He's just trying to find some love, Mr. Jenkins. Can't you see that?" she said, standing up for Buddy. Mr. Jenkins waved her off. "Love? A dog is just a dog. They're dirty and carry germs. Get rid of it." His voice was loud, and Mrs. Thompson's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. How could he be so cruel? Buddy is not dirty, he's just been living on the streets. "He deserves kindness just like anyone else," she insisted, her voice firm. But deep down, she felt a mix of fear and frustration. She didn't want to get into an argument, especially over a dog that had come to her for help. Mr. Jenkins snorted and walked further into the shop, pretending to browse. but Mrs. Thompson could feel his eyes on her and Buddy. She couldn't shake off the feeling that he was judging them, making assumptions based solely on what he saw. As the minutes passed, more customers came and went. Buddy lay at Mrs. Thompson's feet, looking up at her with those big, soulful eyes. She couldn't help but stroke his head, feeling the soft fur beneath her fingers. "You're a good boy, Buddy," she whispered. "We'll figure this out together." Suddenly, the bell jingled again, and in walked a young girl named Lily. She was a bright and cheerful girl, full of life, with curly hair and a wide smile. Lily loved animals and often stopped by to pet Buddy whenever she saw him. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson." "Hi, Buddy," she exclaimed, running over to the dog. Buddy's ears perked up, and he wagged his tail excitedly. Mrs. Thompson smiled, feeling a warm rush of joy. "Look at that, Buddy. Someone loves you." Lily knelt down, giving Buddy a gentle scratch behind the ears. "I saw you have a doll." "Where did you get it?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Buddy perked up again, as if he understood every word. He nudged the doll with his nose, and Lily giggled. "You brought it here. That's so cool." Mrs. Thompson watched the interaction, her heart swelling. "He's been bringing that doll to me every day. I wonder what it means to him," she mused, glancing down at Buddy, who was now looking back and forth between Lily and the doll. Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Maybe he wants to play with it," she suggested. "Or maybe it belongs to someone who needs it." The thought hit Mrs. Thompson hard. What if the doll was significant to a child somewhere? Just then, the door swung open, and a group of boys came in, laughing and shouting. Among them was Danny, a boy known for his troublemaking. He was white and had a reputation for being mean to anyone he deemed different. The atmosphere in the shop shifted as they entered, and Mrs. Thompson felt a knot in her stomach. "Look at that stupid dog!" Danny shouted, pointing at Buddy. "What's he doing in here? Shouldn't he be out chasing rats?" The other boys laughed, and Mrs. Thompson felt her heart race. She hated how they treated others, especially those who were vulnerable. Buddy growled softly, baring his teeth. Mrs. Thompson quickly knelt beside him, petting him gently. "It's okay, Buddy. You're safe here," she whispered. But the laughter from the boys grew louder, and she could feel the tension rising in the air. "Why don't you take that ugly doll and get out of here, mutt?" Danny taunted, stepping closer. "No one wants you around." His words were sharp and mean, and Mrs. Thompson's blood boiled. She couldn't believe how cruel kids could be. "Leave him alone," Lily shouted, standing up for Buddy. "He's just a dog, and he hasn't done anything wrong." Her small voice rang out, full of courage, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Danny smirked but didn't back down. "What's the dog gonna do? Bark at us?" He laughed again, and Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of sadness and anger. Why did people always have to be so cruel? "Enough." Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the air like a knife. She stood tall, putting herself between Buddy and the boys. "You will not talk to him like that. He deserves kindness, just like everyone else." The boys exchanged surprised glances, not used to being confronted like this. "Whatever," Danny muttered, rolling his eyes. "Let's go, guys." He and his friends turned to leave, but not before throwing one last glance at Buddy. "Yeah, you better run," Lily shouted after them, her voice filled with determination. As the door swung shut behind the boys, Mrs. Thompson let out a sigh of relief. She knelt down to Buddy again, who seemed to relax as the tension faded. "See, Buddy? You have friends here," she said, smiling at both Buddy and Lily. They were a little family, bonded by kindness and understanding. As the afternoon sun started to dip in the sky, casting a warm glow through the shop windows, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy was trying to tell her something. Why did he bring the doll? Where had he found it? And what had it meant to him? Just then, the bell jingled again, and an elderly woman walked in. She was a regular customer who loved to chat with Mrs. Thompson. "Good afternoon, dear," she said with a smile, her eyes sparkling. "What have you got there?" Mrs. Thompson held up the doll. "And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell." "This little one was brought in by Buddy here," she said, gesturing to the dog. The woman leaned in closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Oh my, that doll looks familiar," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "I think I've seen it in the neighborhood. It belongs to a little girl named Kayla." The mention of the name sent a jolt through Mrs. Thompson. "Kayla? What happened to her?" she asked, her heart racing. "Oh, dear. She's been missing for a few days now. Her family is beside themselves with worry," the woman replied, her voice shaking. Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine. Could the dog's daily deliveries of the doll be connected to Kayla's disappearance? "Do you think Buddy might know something?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with concern. Mrs. Thompson didn't know how to answer. She looked down at Buddy, who was now watching them closely, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. "Maybe we should try to find out," Mrs. Thompson suggested, her mind racing. "There's got to be more to this than just a stray dog bringing in a doll." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the shop floor, Mrs. Thompson realized that this was just the beginning. She felt a sense of urgency, a need to uncover the mystery behind Buddy and the doll. There was a story waiting to be told, and she was determined to find it. With a deep breath, she gathered her thoughts. "We need to help Buddy, and we need to find out where that doll came from." And just like that, the adventure began. The warm sunlight poured through the window of Mrs. Thompson's little shop, casting golden rays on the shelves filled with snacks, toys, and bright candy. It was another busy day, and the cheerful jingle of the shop door announced every customer who entered. Mrs. Thompson was busy rearranging some candy jars when she heard the familiar sound of paws patting on the floor. "Here he is again," she exclaimed, glancing down to see the stray dog enter. His fur was a mix of brown and black, and he looked a bit scruffy but friendly. Today, he dragged along the same worn-out doll he had brought every day for the past week. It seemed to be his favorite thing. As the dog approached her, Mrs. Thompson knelt down, a smile spreading across her face. "What do you have for me today?" she asked, reaching out to pet his head. He dropped the doll at her feet, and she noticed its dusty pink dress, now almost a faded beige. The doll's hair was tangled, and one eye was missing, but there was something endearing about it. "Why do you keep bringing me this old thing?" she wondered aloud, scratching the dog's ears. He wagged his tail happily, as if he understood her question. Mrs. Thompson picked up the doll, inspecting it closely. It was clearly well-loved, its fabric soft from years of cuddling. She noticed a small tag stitched inside the dress. Curiosity sparkled in her eyes. "What do you say we see what your little friend has to say?" she said with a laugh, pulling the doll closer. But just as she was about to check the tag, the doorbell jingled again, and a group of teenagers burst in, laughing and shoving each other playfully. Mrs. Thompson straightened up, trying to push aside her intrigue about the doll. "Hey there, boys," she greeted, putting on her friendly shopkeeper face. The dog, however, became alert, sensing the shift in energy. He stood stiffly, his tail no longer wagging, eyes fixed on the newcomers. The teenagers, noticing the dog's sudden tension, paused in their laughter. "What's with the mutt?" one of them scoffed, a white boy with messy hair and a loud laugh. He stepped forward, looking down at the dog as if he were something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. "Leave him alone," Mrs. Thompson said, a protective feeling swelling inside her. "He's just a stray looking for some kindness." But the boy shrugged, a smirk plastered on his face. "Strays are just pests. Why do you keep him around, old lady?" Mrs. Thompson felt a flash of anger. "He's not a pest. He's a good dog." She glanced back at the dog, who now looked worried. The boy reached down and kicked the doll, sending it spinning across the floor. The dog barked loudly, rushing forward to protect it. "Hey! That's not cool," Mrs. Thompson shouted, her heart racing. The dog growled, standing between the doll and the laughing teenagers. The others joined in, taunting him. "What's he gonna do? Bite us?" one girl mocked, rolling her eyes. Just then, Mrs. Thompson felt her chest tighten. She couldn't let them bully this poor dog, who had done nothing wrong. "That's enough. If you can't behave, you need to leave," she said firmly, crossing her arms. The laughter faded slightly, but the boy remained defiant. "Whatever. It's just a dumb dog and a broken doll," he retorted, turning away. As the teenagers walked out, Mrs. Thompson bent down to comfort the dog. "You okay, buddy?" she asked gently, feeling his tension begin to ease. He licked her hand, looking up at her with trusting eyes. For a moment, Mrs. Thompson felt a strong connection to this stray dog. He was a fighter, just like her. She had faced her own battles in life, trying to keep her little shop alive in a neighborhood that had seen better days. She couldn't help but think of how many people had judged her, simply because she was a woman running a business on her own. After the teenagers left, she knelt beside the dog and picked up the doll. "Let's see what you've got, Kayla," she murmured, reading the name stitched inside. The name sent a shiver down her spine. She remembered a news story she had heard just days ago about a missing girl named Kayla. That night, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the doll held secrets. She decided to research Kayla's story online. She found articles detailing how the little girl had gone missing while playing outside with her friends. Her heart ached at the thought of a family desperately searching for their child. She read about the last time Kayla was seen. It was just a few blocks away from her shop. How did this happen? She wondered aloud, the question swirling in her mind. It seemed like a nightmare for any parent. The next day, as she opened the shop, Mrs. Thompson glanced at the dog, who was waiting outside, tail wagging. "Let's go for a walk, buddy," she said, feeling an urge to uncover more about the doll. She took the dog to the park where Kayla had last been seen, hoping to find any clues that could help. As they walked, she thought about the doll and the stories it might carry. The dog seemed more alert than ever, sniffing the ground and occasionally looking up at her, as if leading her to something important. Suddenly, they came across a group of kids playing. One of the girls looked familiar, and Mrs. Thompson recognized her from the news coverage. It was Kayla's best friend. "Hey there," Mrs. Thompson called, waving to the girl. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The girl looked up, her smile fading as she approached. Are you looking for Kayla?" she asked, her voice small. Mrs. Thompson nodded, feeling the weight of the conversation. "I found this doll." "It belonged to her, didn't it?" she asked, holding it up. The girl's eyes widened, and she gasped. "Yes. That was Kayla's. She loved that doll. What happened to her? Do you know?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her heart racing. "I don't know," the girl replied, tears brimming in her eyes. "She just disappeared." Mrs. Thompson knelt down to the girl's level, her heart breaking for the child. "I'm trying to find her. I think the dog knows something. He brings this doll to my shop every day." "Really?" The girl's eyes lit up with a mix of hope and fear. "Maybe he's trying to tell you where she is." Mrs. Thompson felt a rush of determination. "Then let's follow him. Maybe he can lead us to Kayla." As they walked together, the dog bounded ahead, sniffing the air and exploring every nook and cranny. Mrs. Thompson and the girl followed closely, their hearts racing with anticipation. The dog paused at a small alley, sniffing intensely. "Should we go in?" the girl asked, a mix of excitement and fear in her voice. "Let's be careful," Mrs. Thompson replied, feeling a twinge of caution. But she also felt an urge to push through. They needed to uncover the truth about Kayla. As they ventured into the alley, they found discarded items, a broken bicycle, some old cans, and, in the corner, a ragged backpack. The dog sniffed at it, his ears perked up. Could this be hers? Mrs. Thompson wondered, feeling a shiver down her spine. Maybe, the girl said, stepping closer. We should check. Just then, a noise echoed from the end of the alley. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced as she turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a white man in a hoodie, eyes darting as if he was searching for something. Run! Mrs. Thompson shouted, pulling the girl back as the dog growled lowly. The man froze for a moment, looking at them with a mix of surprise and irritation. What are you doing here? He barked, stepping closer. We're just looking, Mrs. Thompson stammered, her heart pounding. Leave. This is none of your business, he said, his voice harsh and threatening. Mrs. Thompson could feel the weight of his words, the air thick with tension. She glanced at the girl, who looked frightened. Let's go, she urged, stepping backward, but the man lunged forward, blocking their path. Fear coursed through Mrs. Thompson, but she knew they couldn't let him intimidate them. Back off, she shouted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The dog barked louder, standing firm between them and the man. Get out of here, mutt, he snarled, trying to shove the dog aside. But the dog stood his ground, growling fiercely. Just then, Mrs. Thompson remembered the doll. We have to get the police, she whispered to the girl, her mind racing. He's hiding something. He might know what happened to Kayla. The girl nodded, determination replacing her fear. Let's go. We can't let him get away. As they turned to run, the man shouted after them, You better watch your back. But Mrs. Thompson didn't look back. Her focus was on getting the girl to safety and bringing the police to uncover the truth. Once outside, Mrs. Thompson fished her phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered. There's a man in an alley, he's suspicious, and I think he might know something about a missing girl, she blurted out, her voice urgent. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way, the operator replied, calm and reassuring. Mrs. Thompson hung up and turned to the girl. We have to wait for the police. They'll take care of it. As they stood together, the dog at their side, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The doll, the dog, and now this mysterious man, everything was connected. She felt a spark of hope mixed with fear. We'll find Kayla, she promised the girl, who nodded, eyes filled with determination. The stray dog sat patiently, watching the alley as if guarding a secret, ready to reveal more as soon as the right moment came. With hearts full of courage, they awaited the arrival of the police, ready to uncover the truth that had long been hidden away. It was a sunny afternoon when the stray dog trotted back into Mrs. Thompson's corner shop, a place that smelled of fresh bread and sweet pastries. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, dragging his old doll behind him, its worn dress fluttering like a flag in the breeze. The dog, with his scruffy fur and bright eyes, had become a familiar sight in the neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but smile every time he visited, but today, something felt different. The shop was busy, with customers browsing the shelves, chatting and laughing. Mrs. Thompson stood behind the counter, organizing her candies when she noticed the dog pacing back and forth. He seemed restless, his eyes darting toward the door as if he was waiting for someone. What's gotten into you today? She asked, kneeling down to his level. The dog looked at her, panting, his tail wagging slightly but with an edge of nervousness. Just then, the door swung open, and a group of teenagers burst in. They were loud and boisterous, wearing hoodies and caps pulled low over their faces. One of them, a tall boy with white skin and a cocky grin, glanced at the dog and then at the doll on the floor. What's this? He sneered, bending down to pick it up. Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. That's not yours. Put it down, she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The dog, sensing the tension, began to growl softly, his hackles raised. The boy looked up, his expression a mix of amusement and defiance. What are you gonna do about it, lady? The other teenagers laughed, egging him on. Come on, man. Just kick it, one of them shouted. Without thinking, the boy lifted his foot and kicked the doll, sending it flying across the shop. The dog barked furiously, racing after it as it landed near the door, its dress now even more tattered. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced as she watched the dog retrieve the doll, cradling it gently in his mouth. She could see the sadness in his eyes, as if he understood that the doll represented something more than just a toy. It was a connection to the little girl who had lost it, a connection to hope and innocence. "Get out! You're not welcome here," she shouted, her voice firm. The teenagers exchanged glances, the laughter fading from their faces as they realized she meant business. The tall boy tossed the doll back at the dog, who barely flinched, still holding it close. "Whatever, old lady. You'll regret this," he mumbled as they pushed through the door, the bell jingling again in their wake. Mrs. Thompson let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her heart still pounding in her chest. She looked down at the dog, who was now sitting on the floor, the doll resting beside him. "You okay, buddy?" she asked softly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. He leaned into her hand, and she felt a deep connection with him. But as the afternoon wore on, a nagging thought lingered in her mind. Who were those boys, and why did they treat the dog and the doll that way? This wasn't just bullying, it felt like something more sinister. She remembered reading about a group of teens causing trouble in the neighborhood, targeting people who seemed vulnerable. And Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this stray dog, with his brave heart, might be caught in the middle of something dangerous. As the sun began to set, the shop started to empty. Mrs. Thompson locked the door, the click echoing in the quiet space. She glanced at the dog, who was still by her side, watching her with wide eyes. "You want to come home with me?" she asked, her heart warming at the thought. He wagged his tail eagerly, and she couldn't resist. "All right then, let's go." That evening, as they walked to her house, Mrs. Thompson thought about the dog's bravery. He had stood up to those boys when she couldn't. But why was he so attached to the doll? What secret was he trying to share? She promised herself she would find out. The following morning, Mrs. Thompson decided to follow the dog. She wanted to see where he went after he left her shop. She opened the store early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and waited. Sure enough, the dog came bounding in, his tail wagging with excitement. She smiled and grabbed a leash, clipping it to his collar. "Let's go on an adventure." As they walked through the neighborhood, she noticed the way people reacted to the dog. Some smiled and waved, while others crossed the street to avoid them. She felt a pang of sadness for her new friend. He deserved love and respect, just like everyone else. They reached a small park, and the dog pulled her toward a cluster of trees. He darted through the bushes, and she followed closely. Then, they stumbled upon something shocking, a group of kids playing, but not just any kids. Among them was a little black girl, her hair in neat braids, sitting on the grass, looking forlorn. Beside her lay a small pile of dolls, each one missing something, a shoe, a dress, an eye. The stray dog approached cautiously, his ears perked up. The girl looked up, her face lighting up with a smile as she spotted him. "Buster," she exclaimed, reaching out her arms. The dog bounded over, licking her face as she laughed. Mrs. Thompson's heart melted. So, this was Buster. The girl hugged him tightly, and Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of warmth wash over her. But then, the laughter faded. A group of older boys, including the tall white boy from the shop, swaggered over. "Look at that loser," one of them sneered, pointing at the girl. "Playing with a dumb dog and a bunch of broken toys." The girl's smile faltered as she clutched Buster closer. "Leave her alone," Mrs. Thompson shouted, stepping forward. She felt a rush of protective energy, her heart racing as she faced the boys. The tall boy stepped closer, a smirk on his face. "What are you gonna do about it?" "She's just a black girl with some ugly dolls," he taunted, and the others laughed. Mrs. Thompson felt a fire ignite within her. She's a child, and she deserves kindness and respect, just like everyone else. Her voice rang out, firm and unwavering. The boys exchanged glances, unsure of how to react to this unexpected confrontation. "Who cares?" the tall boy retorted, crossing his arms defiantly. You're just an old lady trying to play hero. You don't know what it's like around here." He stepped closer, and Mrs. Thompson could see the anger in his eyes. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "It doesn't matter where you come from, everyone deserves love. You should be ashamed of yourselves," she declared, her heart pounding. Buster barked at the boys, standing protectively in front of the girl, as if he understood the importance of the moment. The tension in the air was thick. The boys shuffled back, but the tall boy refused to back down. "Whatever. This isn't over," he growled before turning away, his friends following hesitantly. As they walked away, Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of relief wash over her. She turned to the girl, who was watching with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Thompson asked gently, kneeling beside her. The girl nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "They always pick on me because I have these old dolls. They say they're ugly," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're beautiful because they belong to you," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "What's your name?" "Kayla," the girl replied, her face brightening just a bit. "This is Buster. He's my best friend." Mrs. Thompson smiled, feeling a sense of connection. "Well, Buster is a hero today. He stood up to those boys for you." Kayla laughed through her tears, and for a moment, everything felt right. But deep down, Mrs. Thompson knew this wasn't over. The boys would come back, and they needed to be stopped. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Thompson walked Kayla and Buster home. They chatted about their favorite games and toys, and for the first time, Kayla smiled genuinely. But in the back of Mrs. Thompson's mind, a storm was brewing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something larger at play, something that went beyond just kids being mean. The next day, she decided to take action. She went to the local community center and spoke with the director about starting a program for kids in the neighborhood, a safe place where they could play and learn together, regardless of their background. She wanted to create a space where everyone felt valued. That evening, as she returned to her shop, she found Buster waiting outside, wagging his tail. "Hey, buddy. Ready for another adventure?" she asked, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. He barked happily, as if he understood her words. Together, they made their way to the park, where Kayla was waiting. But this time, she wasn't alone. A group of kids had gathered, curious about the stray dog and his new friend. Mrs. Thompson felt a surge of hope as she watched them play, their laughter ringing out in the evening air. But just as she began to relax, the familiar group of boys appeared on the edge of the park. The tall boy stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "What's going on here? You think you can just bring your dog and pretend everything's fine?" he taunted. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart race again. She knew they had to stand together against this bullying. "This is a safe place for everyone," she declared, her voice steady. "We're all friends here." Buster barked, standing beside Kayla, and the other kids rallied around her. It was a small but powerful moment, and Mrs. Thompson felt a glimmer of hope. They were stronger together, and they would not be silenced by fear or prejudice. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the park, Mrs. Thompson knew this was just the beginning. Together with Buster and Kayla, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The stray dog had brought them all together, and in that moment, hope felt like a living, breathing thing, ready to take flight. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink as Mrs. Thompson finished tidying up her corner shop. The last customer had left, and the door swung gently on its hinges, creating a soft sound. She glanced outside, where the stray dog, whom she had started to call Buddy, was pacing back and forth. It was almost time for his daily visit, and her heart warmed at the sight of him. But as she watched him, a sense of unease settled in. Buddy wasn't just waiting, he seemed restless, glancing toward the alley where the group of teenagers usually gathered. Mrs. Thompson remembered how they had kicked the doll the day before, and a chill ran down her spine. She felt a need to protect Buddy and the doll he cared for so much. Suddenly, she noticed a dark figure lurking in the shadows. The figure was tall and wore a hoodie that concealed his face. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced. She squinted, trying to see if she recognized him. Was he one of those kids? Or perhaps someone more dangerous? She quickly grabbed her phone from the counter and prepared to call for help. Please don't let anything happen, she whispered to herself, feeling a lump form in her throat. Just then, Buddy barked fiercely, breaking the silence of the evening. The sound echoed off the walls, making Mrs. Thompson jump. Buddy, come here, she called, but he didn't listen. Instead, he charged toward the figure, fur bristling, teeth bared. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen him act like this before. He was protective, fierce, and that scared her. As the figure stepped closer, Mrs. Thompson could see the glint of something shiny in his hand. It looked like a crowbar. Panic washed over her. What was he planning to do? The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just a random person. This was someone who meant trouble, and he was right outside her shop. She dialed 911, her fingers trembling as she pressed the numbers. Please, I need help. There's a suspicious man outside my store. He's threatening a dog. Her voice quivered as she tried to explain the situation quickly. He's trying to break into a car. The operator asked her questions, but she could barely focus. All she could think about was Buddy and how much she wanted him to be safe. Outside, Buddy continued to bark, drawing the attention of the man. Shut that dog up, the man yelled, his voice deep and angry. He waved the crowbar in the air, and Mrs. Thompson gasped. This was not going to end well. She could see the dog standing his ground, his body tense, ready to defend himself and the doll that had become so important to him. The man took a step closer, and Mrs. Thompson felt her heart race. She wanted to rush outside to help Buddy, but what could she do against someone with a weapon? Please, hurry, she pleaded into the phone. He's threatening my dog. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but the seconds felt like hours. Every tick of the clock made her more anxious. She watched helplessly from behind the glass, wishing she could do something. Would the police arrive in time? What if the man hurt Buddy? Suddenly, the man took another step forward, and Buddy growled low in his throat. You think you're tough, huh? The man sneered. He reached down, as if to grab Buddy, but the dog was quick. He lunged forward, snapping his teeth near the man's hand. Get away, you mutt, he shouted, backing up slightly. Mrs. Thompson's heart swelled with pride for Buddy. He was being brave, but she worried he might get hurt. Stay strong, Buddy, she whispered under her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter tightly. The man glanced around, as if checking for anyone else nearby. It was clear he felt bold, thinking he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Mrs. Thompson hated that he felt that way, especially when she knew that Buddy was just trying to protect something precious. A loud siren suddenly pierced the evening air, and Mrs. Thompson's heart soared with hope. They're here, she exclaimed, watching as 2 police cars pulled up outside the shop. Officers jumped out, their uniforms gleaming in the fading light. Get away from that dog, one officer shouted, running toward the man. Buddy, sensing the shift in power, barked even louder, his tail wagging slightly as he realized help had arrived. The man hesitated, glancing back at the officers, but he quickly turned to run. Not so fast, another officer shouted, and they chased after him. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, praying they would catch him. As the officers pursued the man, Buddy stood firm, guarding the doll that lay forgotten on the pavement. Mrs. Thompson rushed outside, relieved to see the police on the scene. Thank you. He was trying to hurt my dog, she called out, her voice shaky but filled with gratitude. One of the officers approached her, concern etched on his face. Is everything all right? Did he harm the dog? No, not yet. Buddy was protecting the doll. She pointed to where the ragged doll lay. It belonged to a missing girl named Kayla. I think that man might be connected to her disappearance. The officer knelt down to examine the doll. "We'll take this seriously," he said, pulling out a small notepad. "Can you tell me what you saw?" Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, trying to recall every detail. "I saw him lurking near the shop earlier. He had a crowbar and seemed to be up to no good. Buddy started barking, and then he threatened him. I was so scared." As she spoke, another officer returned, panting. "We lost him near the alley. But we'll keep looking." Mrs. Thompson felt a rush of frustration. "He can't get away. He needs to be caught. He's dangerous." The officers nodded, their expressions serious. "We'll increase patrols in the area. Thank you for calling us. You did the right thing." But as they discussed their next steps, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling of worry. What if the man came back? What if Buddy was in danger again? Suddenly, Buddy trotted over to her, nudging the doll with his nose. She knelt down, her heart swelling with love for the brave dog. "You did so well, Buddy. I'm so proud of you." The officer watched the scene unfold, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "That dog really cares about that doll, doesn't he?" "Yes, he does," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice softening. "I think he knows it belongs to someone who needs it. It's like he's on a mission to bring it back." They all shared a moment of silence, contemplating the bond between Buddy and the doll. It was a bond that transcended fear, showing how love and loyalty could shine even in the darkest times. But in the back of her mind, Mrs. Thompson couldn't forget the man who had threatened them. She felt a sense of urgency building within her. They needed to find him. They needed to protect their community and everyone in it. As she watched Buddy, she realized he had become more than just a stray dog. He was a symbol of hope. Together, they would face whatever came next, determined to uncover the truth and bring justice for Kayla and the others affected by the man's actions. "Let's get you inside, Buddy," she said gently, leading him back toward the shop. "We'll figure this out together." The officers remained alert, ready for anything. But Mrs. Thompson felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She would not let fear win. She would stand up for her community and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. That night, as they closed the shop, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but she had Buddy by her side. And with that, she felt like they could take on anything the world threw at them. Mrs. Thompson clutched her phone tightly, her heart pounding as she watched the dog stand guard over the doll. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement, making the scene seem even more dramatic. What was happening outside her shop felt surreal, like a scene from a movie, but it was all too real. "Why isn't anyone else outside?" she muttered under her breath. The corner shop, usually filled with chatter and laughter, felt eerily quiet. The other store owners had gone home for the night, and only the stray dog and the unknown man remained. She glanced again at the hoodie-clad figure, feeling a chill run down her spine. In the 10 seconds it took her to gather her courage, she saw the dog bark fiercely, as if sensing the danger lurking nearby. The boy in the hoodie shuffled, glancing around nervously. He had been watching the doll too closely, and she could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. What could it be? A knife? A weapon? Her breath quickened as she dialed 911. "Hello? 911? I need help. There's a strange man outside my shop." Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "There's a dog, and he's protecting something, a doll." The operator's voice was calm, but Mrs. Thompson barely heard the reassurance. Her eyes were glued to the window. The boy had moved closer now, his expression shifting from nervousness to determination. He reached for the doll, and Mrs. Thompson felt her stomach drop. "Please, hurry," she pleaded, her voice almost a whisper. As she waited for the police, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The dog, whom she had affectionately named Max, seemed to sense her fear. He barked louder, his fur standing on end as he positioned himself between the man and the doll. "Stay back," she yelled, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Max was just a dog, but in that moment, he felt like her only ally. She remembered the news reports about a little girl named Kayla who had gone missing in the neighborhood just days ago. The thought of Kayla's name echoed in her mind, making the urgency of the situation even clearer. Suddenly, the doorbell jingled as the front door swung open. It was Mr. Adams, the shop owner next door. "What's going on, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, glancing at the commotion outside. "There's a man trying to take that dog's doll," she said, pointing out the window. "I called 911. We have to help Max." Mr. Adams' eyes widened as he surveyed the scene. "I'll call the cops too," he said, pulling out his phone. "Stay back, we don't know what that guy is capable of." Together, they watched as the boy in the hoodie leaned down, reaching out to grab the doll. Max growled, his body tense, teeth bared. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart race. "What if he hurts the dog?" she gasped. "Let's not take any chances," Mr. Adams replied, his voice steady. "We need to keep our distance and wait for the police." But the situation was spiraling out of control. The boy suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the doll and pulling it away from Max. The dog barked furiously, and Mrs. Thompson could see his fur bristle with anger. "No! Max, no!" she shouted, but the dog was already in motion, darting towards the boy. The boy stumbled back, dropping the doll, but his face was filled with anger. "Get off me, dog!" he yelled, kicking at Max, who barely dodged the blow. Mrs. Thompson's heart sank. She was terrified. How could anyone be so cruel? "Stay back, Max," she yelled, but the dog was already defending his territory. The boy looked around, realizing he was outnumbered, and with a desperate glance at the doll, he took off down the street. Max chased after him, barking loudly, as if saying, "Not on my watch." Mrs. Thompson rushed outside, calling for Max come back. "Boy," she cried, fear gnawing at her. The night air was filled with tension, and she could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins. Mr. Adams followed closely, his phone still in hand. "They're on their way," he assured her, but she barely heard him. All she could think about was Max, the brave dog who had shown up at her shop day after day, and now he was chasing after danger. They turned the corner, and just as Mrs. Thompson feared, she saw the boy darting into a dark alley. Max was close behind, barking furiously. "Stop," she shouted, but it was no use. The boy was fast, and the alley swallowed him whole. "Stay here," Mr. Adams shouted, but Mrs. Thompson wasn't listening. She dashed after them, heart pounding. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist around her, but she pressed on, desperate to keep Max safe. As she entered the alley, she could hear the distant sound of sirens approaching, but the chaos was still unfolding. Max had cornered the boy, standing firm, growling with all his might. "Get away from him," she yelled, but her voice felt small in the vast darkness. The boy was backed against the wall, and he glared at Max, hatred in his eyes. "Stupid dog," he spat, pulling something from his pocket. Mrs. Thompson squinted, trying to see what it was. Was it a knife? The fear coiled tightly in her chest. Just then, the police arrived, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. "Freeze!" an officer shouted, jumping out of the car. The boy hesitated, his bravado fading as he realized he was trapped. Max stood his ground, still barking ferociously. The officer moved in quickly, hand on his holster. "Get your hands up," he commanded. The boy raised his hands, the weapon clattering to the ground. It was only a screwdriver, but Mrs. Thompson's relief was short-lived. "Are you okay?" the officer asked, stepping closer to Max, who still stood protectively in front of the doll. Mrs. Thompson rushed forward, her heart racing. "Max saved the doll. He was trying to protect it," she explained, pointing to the precious object lying in the dirt. The officer knelt beside the doll, inspecting it carefully. "This is important evidence," he said, glancing up at Mrs. Thompson. "Is this the doll that belongs to the missing girl?" "Yes," she exclaimed, her voice rising with urgency. "It's Kayla's doll. I saw the news. We need to get this to the family." The officer nodded, his face serious. "We'll take it from here. Thank you for calling us." As they cuffed the boy and led him away, Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of emotions. She was relieved but also furious at the situation. "Why would he do this?" she demanded, turning to Mr. Adams, who had caught up with her. "I don't know, but it's clear there's something very wrong in our community," he replied. "People shouldn't have to live in fear like this." Max, still standing by the doll, seemed to sense her anxiety. He turned to her, his big brown eyes filled with trust. "You did good, boy," she whispered, kneeling to pet him. As the officers secured the area and began asking questions, Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The bravery of a stray dog had made all the difference that night. Max had risked everything to protect the doll, and in doing so, he had brought the community together. "Let's hope this is the last we see of Trouble," Mr. Adams said quietly, watching as the boy was placed in the back of the police car. "And that Kayla comes home safe." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her heart heavy. "We need to make sure everyone feels safe again." As the police worked, she realized this was just the beginning of something bigger. The community needed to unite against the real dangers that lurked in the shadows. She looked down at Max, who wagged his tail, unaware of how much he had changed everything. "Tomorrow, we'll have a meeting," she declared. "We can't let fear win." Max barked, as if he understood. And in that moment, Mrs. Thompson felt a spark of hope igniting within her. Together, they would face whatever came next, side by side, a woman and her brave dog against the world. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the corner shop where Mrs. Thompson had spent most of her life. She had always loved this time of day. It felt peaceful, but tonight, her heart raced with unease. The events of the past few days swirled in her mind, like leaves caught in a gust of wind. The stray dog, the doll, and the strange man lingered like shadows in her thoughts. As she cleaned the counters, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Just then, she heard the familiar bark of the dog outside. It was a sound she had come to cherish. Mrs. Thompson rushed to the window, her heart pounding. There he was, the shaggy, brown stray with the soulful eyes. But he wasn't alone this time. A group of police officers approached the shop, their uniforms crisp against the fading light. The dog stood in front of the shop, barking at them with a mix of fear and protectiveness. Mrs. Thompson's heart fluttered. This was it. They had come to solve the mystery of the doll and the strange man she had seen. She opened the door and stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapping around her like a blanket. "Officers," she called, waving them over. "You've got to see this." The dog seemed to sense her urgency. He stopped barking and looked at her, as if urging her to explain. One of the officers knelt down, slowly reaching out his hand. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "We're here to help." The dog sniffed the officer's hand cautiously before wagging his tail, as if he understood that they meant no harm. Mrs. Thompson felt a rush of relief. "Thank you for coming," she said, glancing around the street. "There's been a lot happening around here. I think it's all connected to that doll." The officer raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath. "For days, this dog has been bringing me a doll that looks like it might belong to a little girl named Kayla who went missing. I'm afraid it's somehow linked to the trouble we've been having around here." The officers exchanged glances. One officer, a tall woman with kind eyes, stood up and said, "Let's take a closer look at that doll." Mrs. Thompson nodded and led them inside the shop, where the doll lay in a box behind the counter. The officers followed her, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. She opened the box, revealing the ragged doll with its stitched dress and faded smile. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I found it with the dog. I think it might have belonged to Kayla." The tall officer picked up the doll, examining it closely. "Do you see this?" She pointed to a small tear in the dress. "This could have happened when the dog brought it back. It looks worn and loved." Mrs. Thompson nodded, feeling a connection to the story behind the doll. I just don't understand why this dog keeps bringing it to me. He must know something. Another officer, a man with a serious expression, spoke up. We need to trace this back. There might be more to this than we realize. He glanced at the other officers. Let's see if we can find out more about this doll and the missing girl. Mrs. Thompson watched as they took notes and made calls. The tension in the room was palpable. She couldn't help but wonder if they would find Kayla, if the dog's daily deliveries could somehow lead them to her. As the officers continued their investigation, Mrs. Thompson's mind raced with questions. Why had the doll appeared at her shop? Why had the dog chosen her? She thought of the boy from the group that hung around the corner, the one who had kicked the doll. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Could he have something to do with the disappearance? Just then, the officer with the kind eyes approached her again. Mrs. Thompson, can you tell us more about the day you saw the strange man? Mrs. Thompson's heart raced. She recalled that unsettling evening, the way the man had lurked outside, his eyes darting around as if he were waiting for something. He looked suspicious. I saw him trying to steal something from a parked car, and the dog was barking at him like he knew he was bad news. The officer nodded, making notes. And the teenagers? Did they seem involved? Yes, Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steadying. They were throwing bottles and laughing. I felt something was off about them too. It's like they were looking for trouble. The officer looked at her thoughtfully. It's important we get this information down. Every little detail can help. Feeling empowered, Mrs. Thompson continued, You know, I saw that boy, the one who kicked the doll, hanging around the park with his friends. I think they might know something about Kayla. The officers nodded, exchanging glances. We'll investigate that lead. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Thank you for your help, the tall officer said. Just then, the stray dog began barking again, his growls deepening. The officers looked outside, and Mrs. Thompson felt a rush of worry. What's happening? Let's see, the man officer said, hurrying to the door. Mrs. Thompson followed closely behind, her heart racing as she stepped outside. The street was dimly lit, but she could see the dog standing defiantly in front of the shop. A figure loomed at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the shadows. The officers immediately recognized the danger. Stay here, ma'am, the tall officer instructed as they moved toward the figure. We'll handle this. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. What if it was the same man from before? What if he was involved in Kayla's disappearance? As the officers approached, the figure turned, and for a moment, Mrs. Thompson's heart sank. It was him, the man in the hoodie. He looked scared, glancing back and forth as if he was about to run. The dog barked fiercely, as if sensing the tension in the air. Hey, the tall officer shouted, trying to get the man's attention. Stop right there. But the man bolted, sprinting toward the alley. The officers dashed after him, their radios crackling with urgency. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen, her heart pounding as she watched the chase unfold. Why are they running? She whispered to herself, her mind racing. She felt a wave of dread wash over her. What could this mean? The dog suddenly took off after the officers, barking loudly. Mrs. Thompson felt a surge of hope. Maybe the dog knew something they didn't. Maybe he could lead them to Kayla. Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alley. The officers rounded the corner, and Mrs. Thompson could barely make out what was happening. She could see the dog sniffing the ground, clearly on the trail of something important. As the officers caught up to the man, he stumbled and fell, hands raised in surrender. I didn't do anything, he shouted, panic in his voice. Please. I was just playing around. Playing around? The tall officer exclaimed. You think we're going to believe that? Mrs. Thompson edged closer, her heart pounding. Is he the one? She wondered. Is he connected to Kayla? The officers held the man down, quickly cuffing him as they questioned him about his involvement with the group of teenagers. Mrs. Thompson could see the fear in his eyes, and she felt a mix of anger and sadness. As they pulled him to his feet, one officer shouted, "We need to check your backpack." The man hesitated, and Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. What if he had something in there that could lead them to Kayla? Finally, the officer unzipped the backpack, revealing a jumble of items: spray paint, broken glass, and, Mrs. Thompson's heart sank, a small toy that looked just like the doll the dog had been bringing to her shop. "Where did you get this?" the officer demanded, holding the toy up for everyone to see. "I don't know. I found it," the man protested, but his eyes darted nervously. The tall officer stepped closer, her expression fierce. "We know you're lying. This could belong to a missing girl." Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of urgency wash over her. "Please, you have to find out more. Kayla is still out there." As the officers continued to interrogate the man, the stray dog stood watch, still growling protectively. Mrs. Thompson felt a deep connection to the dog. They were both on a mission, searching for the truth. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, the officers seemed to reach a breakthrough. The man's bravado crumbled, and he began to spill details about the group and their actions in the neighborhood. "That's right," he mumbled, his voice shaking. "We were just messing around. I didn't mean to. I swear." Mrs. Thompson watched in disbelief as the pieces began to fall into place. It was as if a dark cloud was lifting, revealing the truth. Maybe, just maybe, they would find Kayla and put an end to this nightmare. The tall officer glanced at Mrs. Thompson, her expression softening. "We'll need you to come down to the station and give a formal statement. We're going to need all the information we can get." Mrs. Thompson nodded, determination filling her heart. She knew this was just the beginning, but she felt a sense of hope as the dog wagged his tail beside her, ready to continue their journey together. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.